General Emma Thompson had spent 25 years serving her country with honor and pride. She had led soldiers through dangerous missions, made difficult decisions under pressure, and earned the respect of everyone who served with her. But today, she was not thinking about her military career or her many achievements. Today, she was simply a loving daughter helping her elderly mother with something as simple as carrying groceries. The quiet town of Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors and children. Played safely in the streets, Emma had grown up in this very house, running through these same streets as a child. Now, at 52 years old, she was back home visiting her mother, Margaret, who was 83 and still lived independently in the family home. Emma wore her favorite casual clothes, comfortable blue jeans and a soft grey sweater that her mother had wear upon for her last Christmas. Her grey hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and there was nothing about her appearance that suggested she held one of the highest ranks in the United States military. She moved with quiet confidence, the kind that comes from years of leadership and making important decisions. But today she was just happy to be spending time with her mother. The two women had spent the morning shopping at the local grocery store, picking out fresh vegetables and ingredients for Margaret's famous apple pie. Emma loved these simple moments with her mother, hearing stories about the neighbors, laughing about old family memories, and just enjoying each other's company. As they walked up the front path to the house, Emma was carrying the heavier bags, while Margaret held onto her arm for support. "Do you remember when you were 7 years old and you tried to bake me a birthday cake?" Margaret asked with a warm smile. "You used salt instead of sugar and wondered why it tasted so terrible." Emma laughed, remembering the disaster in the kitchen and how her mother had pretended the cake was delicious anyway. "You ate two whole pieces just to make me feel better," she said. "That's when I knew you were the kindest person in the world." But their peaceful moment was about to be interrupted. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson was watching them through her lace curtains with growing suspicion. Mrs. Patterson was 75 years old and had lived in the neighborhood for decades. But she had become increasingly worried about crime and strangers in recent years. She watched the news every night and had developed a habit of being suspicious of anyone she didn't immediately recognize. "I don't know that woman," Mrs. Patterson whispered to herself as she watched Emma help her mother. "She looks different, too confident for this neighborhood. What if she's trying to take advantage of poor Margaret?" Mrs. Patterson's mind began to race with worried thoughts. She had heard stories about people who pretended to be helpful but were actually criminals. Emma's confident way of moving and her unfamiliar appearance made Mrs. Patterson feel uneasy. Without taking time to think clearly or consider that Emma might simply be Margaret's daughter, Mrs. Patterson reached for her phone with shaking hands. "Police department," came the voice on the other end of the line. "Yes, hello," Mrs. Patterson said nervously. "I want to report suspicious activity at the Thompson house on Maple Street. There's a woman there I don't recognize, and I think she might be trying to break in or hurt Mrs. Thompson. She looks, well, she looks like she doesn't belong in our neighborhood." The police dispatcher took down the information and assured Mrs. Patterson that an officer would be sent to check on the situation immediately. Mrs. Patterson hung up the phone feeling proud that she had done her civic duty, never imagining the terrible chain of events she had just set in motion. Within just a few minutes, Officer James Wilson arrived in his black and white patrol car. He was 26 years old and had been working as a police officer for only 2 years. Wilson was eager to prove himself and had strong opinions about what kinds of people belonged in different neighborhoods. As he stepped out of his car, he had already formed ideas about what he expected to find based on Mrs. Patterson's description. Emma and Margaret were still standing near the front door, talking quietly about their shopping trip. When Officer Wilson approached them, his hand was resting on his belt near his weapon, and his face showed no friendliness or warmth. "Excuse me, ma'am," Wilson called out in a sharp, demanding voice. "I need to see some identification right now." Emma turned round calmly, surprised by the officer's hostile tone, but determined to remain polite and respectful. "Good afternoon, officer," she replied in her steady, professional voice. "I'm Emma Thompson, and this is my mother's house. Is there some kind of problem I can help you with?" Wilson's expression grew colder as he looked at Emma. Her calm confidence seemed to anger him rather than reassure him. "I received a call about suspicious activity at this address," he said, his voice becoming more aggressive. "I need to see your identification immediately, and I need to know what you're doing here." Emma reached into her black leather purse and pulled out her military identification card. The card clearly showed her photograph, her rank as a general in the United States Army, and all the official seals and markings that proved its authenticity. She handed it to Wilson with a slight smile, expecting that this would quickly clear up any misunderstanding. "Here you go, officer," she said politely. "I'm a general in the U.S. Army, and I'm currently visiting my mother for the weekend. We just returned from grocery shopping." Officer Wilson took the identification card and barely glanced at it before handing it back to Emma with a dismissive expression. His mind was already made up about what he believed, and no amount of evidence was going to change his opinion. "This looks fake to me," Wilson said with a sneer. "There's no way someone like you could be a general in the army." The fluorescent lights in the police station buzzed overhead as Emma was led through the front doors in handcuffs. The building smelled of old coffee and disinfectant, and the grey walls made everything feel cold and uninviting. Emma had never been inside a police station as anything other than a visiting dignitary, and now she was being treated like a criminal. Her heart was still racing with worry about her mother, who had collapsed on the front steps just moments before. Sergeant Robert Davies sat behind the front desk, his thick fingers typing slowly on an old computer keyboard. He had been working at the Millbrook Police Department for 15 years and had seen all kinds of people come through those doors when Officer Wilson brought Emma in. Davies looked up with tired eyes and immediately made assumptions about what he saw. "What do we have here, Wilson?" Davies asked, not bothering to stand up or show any respect. Officer Wilson pushed Emma forward slightly and spoke with a satisfied smirk on his face. "Says she's a general in the army. Can you believe that? Found her acting suspicious at the Thompson house. Neighbor called it in." Davies looked Emma up and down, taking in her casual clothes and handcuffed hands. In his mind, generals were supposed to look a certain way, and Emma did not fit his expectations. He had never met a real general before, but he was sure they would be different from the woman standing in front of him. Emma stood as straight as she could despite the handcuffs, drawing on decades of military training to maintain her composure. "Sergeant Davies," she said, reading his name tag, "I respectfully request to make my phone call. There has been a serious mistake here, and I need to contact my office to clear this up." Davies reached for Emma's military identification card, which Wilson had placed on the desk. He picked it up and examined it for a few seconds, turning it over in his hands. The card looked official with its government seals and Emma's photograph. But Davies had already decided it must be fake. "Nice try, lady," he said with a dismissive laugh, tossing the card aside like it was worthless. "You can make your phone call later. Right now, you're going to the holding cell where you belong." Emma felt her heart sink as she watched her identification card slide across the desk. "Sergeant, please look at that card more carefully. It's completely legitimate. I'm General Emma Thompson, and I was simply visiting my elderly mother when this misunderstanding occurred. But Davies was not interested in listening. He had made up his mind about Emma the moment he saw her, and nothing she said was going to change his opinion. He signaled to another officer to take Emma to the holding area in the back of the building. The holding cell was small and windowless, with concrete walls painted an ugly shade of green. There was a hard metal bench attached to one wall and a small sink in the corner that dripped constantly. Emma sat down on the bench and tried to process what was happening to her. In 25 years of military service, she had faced dangerous situations and difficult challenges, but she had never felt so helpless and alone. Ours passed slowly in the cramped cell. Emma could hear the officers outside talking and laughing, and occasionally she caught pieces of their conversation. They were making jokes about the fake general they had caught, and some of them were placing bets on what her real story might be. Each cruel word felt like a knife in Emma's heart, but she refused to let them break her spirit. "Please," Emma called out after 4 long hours had passed. "I need to make my phone call. My mother has a serious heart condition, and I saw her collapse when you arrested me. I need to check on her condition." Sergeant Davies was still at his desk, and he shouted back without even looking up from his paperwork. "Keep it down in there. You will get your call when I decide you can have it. Not before." Emma closed her eyes and took deep breaths, trying to stay calm in an impossible situation. She thought about all the young soldiers she had commanded over the years, men and women who had looked to her for leadership during their darkest moments. She had taught them to keep their composure when everything seemed hopeless, to hold onto their dignity even when others tried to take it away. Now she needed to follow her own advice. Meanwhile, across town at Millbrook General Hospital, Margaret Thompson was lying in a bed in the emergency room. The stress and shock of seeing her daughter arrested had caused her blood pressure to spike dangerously high, and she was having chest pain that worried the doctors. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, sat beside the bed holding Margaret's frail hand, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "I'm so sorry, Margaret," Mrs. Patterson whispered, her voice shaking with guilt. "I was wrong to call the police. I let my fear and suspicion make me do something terrible to your daughter." Margaret squeezed her neighbor's hand weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We all make mistakes, dear, but my Emma is a good person. She has spent her whole life serving others and protecting people. She would never hurt anyone." Mrs. Patterson nodded, knowing that Margaret was right. She had acted out of fear and prejudice, and now an innocent woman was suffering because of a hasty phone call. She promised herself that she would find a way to make things right. Somehow, back at the police station, Emma could hear the officers changing shifts as the day turned to evening. She had now been in custody for 8 hours without being allowed to make her phone call, and her stomach was empty because no one had offered her any food or water. Her heart was full of worry about her mother's condition, and she felt more alone than she had ever felt in her entire life. "How is my mother?" Emma asked a passing officer, desperation creeping into her voice. "She collapsed when you arrested me. Please, can someone at least check on her condition?" The officer just walked by without responding, as if Emma was invisible. Emma sat back down on the hard bench, feeling the weight of injustice pressing down on her shoulders. But somewhere deep inside her heart, she held on to hope. She knew the truth would come out eventually. It had too. After 10 long and exhausting hours in the cold holding cell, Emma heard footsteps approaching her door. She looked up to see Sergeant Davies standing outside the bars. And for the first time since her arrest, he looked uncomfortable and uncertain. His confident attitude from earlier had disappeared, replaced by something that looked almost like worry. Davies fumbled with his keys for a moment before speaking. "All right, you can make your phone call now." he said in a gruff voice, trying to sound like he was still in control of the situation. But Emma could see the doubt in his eyes as he unlocked the heavy metal door. Emma stood up slowly. Her body stiff from sitting on the hard bench for so many hours, her legs felt weak, and her head was spinning slightly from not eating or drinking anything since her rest. But she was determined to stay strong and focused. This phone call might be her only chance to get help and find out about her mother's condition. Davies led her down a narrow hallway to where an old black telephone hung on the wall. The phone looked like it had been there for decades, with scratches and dents all over its surface. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the receiver, not from fear but from the stress and exhaustion of the past 10 hours. She dialed the direct number to her aide's office at the Pentagon, a number she had memorized years ago. The phone rang once, then twice, and Emma held her breath, praying that someone would answer. On the second ring, she heard a familiar voice that filled her with relief. "General Thompson's office. This is Colonel Harrison," came the crisp, professional voice of Lieutenant Colonel Michael Harrison, her trusted aide who had worked with her for the past 3 years. "Michael, it's Emma," she said quietly, glancing at Sergeant Davies, who was standing nearby, pretending not to listen, but clearly hearing every word. "I need your help. I'm in jail in Millbrook, and I can't reach my mother." There was a moment of complete silence on the other end of the line. Emma could almost hear Michael's mind trying to process what she had just said. Finally, he spoke again, and his voice was filled with shock and disbelief. "Mom, did you say you're in jail? General, what's happening? Are you hurt? Is this some kind of joke?" Emma quickly began to explain the situation. Speaking in a calm but urgent voice, she told Michael about visiting her mother, about the neighbor's phone call, about Officer Wilson's refusal to believe her identification, and about being held for 10 hours without being allowed to make a phone call. As she spoke, she noticed that Sergeant Davies was listening intently, and his face was growing pale with each detail she shared. Davies had begun to realize that maybe, just maybe, this woman really was who she claimed to be. The way she spoke, the confidence in her voice, the specific details about military procedures, it was all starting to make him very nervous about the situation he had helped create. "General, I'm contacting the Joint Chiefs immediately," Michael said with urgent determination in his voice. "We'll have you out of there within the hour. And ma'am, I'll personally check on your mother's condition and make sure she's getting the care she needs." Emma felt tears of relief welling up in her eyes as she hung up the phone. For the first time in 10 hours, she felt like someone was going to help her. She knew that Michael would move heaven and earth to get her out of this situation, and she trusted him completely. Within minutes of Emma's phone call, telephones were ringing throughout the Pentagon building in Washington. Military officials were being awakened from sleep, pulled out of meetings, and called back from dinner with their families. The news was spreading quickly through the highest levels of the United States Military Command. General David Miller, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was in an important meeting about overseas operations when his aide burst through the door without knocking. The aide's face was red from running, and he was breathing heavily. "Sir, we have an emergency situation," the aide said, trying to catch his breath. "General Thompson has been unlawfully arrested and held for 10 hours without cause in a small town police station." General Miller's face turned bright red with anger. He was known for his calm demeanor, but this news made him furious. "Get me the Millbrook police chief on the phone right now," he ordered, his voice shaking with rage. "And contact the FBI immediately. This is a federal matter that involves the illegal detention of a high-ranking military officer back at the Millbrook police station." Sergeant Davies was pacing nervously around the front desk area. He had made Several phone calls of his own after hearing Emma's conversation, and he was starting to understand the enormous magnitude of the situation they had created. His 15 years of experience told him that this was about to become a very serious problem. Officer Wilson sat at his desk nearby, still convinced that he had done the right thing. He watched Davies pacing back and forth and wondered why his sergeant looked so worried about what seemed like a simple rest. "Davies, you look worried," Wilson said casually. "She's just some woman trying to con us with a fake military ID. We did our job correctly." Davies stopped pacing and looked at Wilson with sweat beading on his forehead. "Wilson, I think we may have made a very serious mistake," he replied, his voice filled with dread. Just then, the main phone at the front desk began to ring. The sound seemed unusually loud in the quiet station, and both men stared at it for a moment before Davies answered. "Millbrook Police Department, Sergeant Davies speaking." Police Chief Patricia Adams was at home eating dinner with her family when she received the call that would chang everything. When she heard the voice of General Miller on the other end of the line, her face went completely white. "Yes, General Miller. I understand completely. Yes, sir. We'll release her immediately and drop all charges." Adams hung up the phone and immediately called the station. "Wilson, Davies, my office. Now." She ordered. Emma was released within minutes, her charges completely dropped. As she walked out of the police station as a free woman, she saw news vans already pulling up outside. Somehow, what about her arrest had gotten out to the media. The story exploded across the nation that evening like wildfire spreading through dry grass. Television news anchors across the country began their broadcasts with the same shocking headline: "Decorate. The Army General unlawfully arrested and held." For 10 hours, Emma's face appeared on millions of television screens, but it was not the mugshot that the police had taken. Instead, news stations showed her official military portrait, where she stood proudly in her dress uniform, her chest decorated with ribbons and medals representing 25 years of dedicated service to her country. Emma sat quietly beside her mother's hospital bed, gently holding Margaret's wrinkled hand in her own. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of the bedside lamp, and the only sounds were the gentle beeping of medical equipment and Margaret's steady breathing. The doctors had said that Margaret was stable now, but the stress and shock of the day had clearly taken a serious toll on her elderly body. "I'm so proud of you, dear," Margaret whispered, her voice weak but filled with love and admiration. "You handled yourself with such grace and dignity, even when they treated you so badly." Emma squeezed her mother's hand gently and smiled through her exhaustion. "I kept thinking about what you taught me when I was a little girl, Mom," she replied softly. "You always said that hatred cannot drive out hatred. Only love can do that." Those words kept me strong today. Margaret's eyes filled with tears of pride as she looked at her daughter. Even after everything that had happened, Emma was not filled with anger or bitterness. Instead, she was thinking about how to make something positive come from this terrible experience. Across town, Officer James Wilson was slowly cleaning out his desk at the police station. His hands trembled as he packed his personal belongings into a small cardboard box. He had been suspended from duty pending a full investigation into his conduct, and he knew that his career in law enforcement was probably over. His wife, Linda, stood beside him with tears streaming down her face, watching her husband's world fall apart. "How could you do this, James?" Linda asked, her voice breaking with emotion. "How could you treat another human being so badly? That woman dedicated her life to serving our country, and you treated her like a criminal." Wilson's hands shook as he placed his coffee mug and family photos into the box. For the first time since the arrest, He was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had done. "I don't know. Linda," he said quietly, his voice filled with shame. "I thought I was doing my job correctly, but I realize now that I let my prejudices and assumptions blind me completely. I saw what I expected to see instead of who she really was." The entire community of Millbrook was in shock as the story spread. Emma's arrest had opened people's eyes to problems and prejudices that had existed in their town for years but had been largely ignored or swept under the rug. Suddenly, everyone was talking about fairness, justice, and how they treated people who looked different from themselves. Town meetings were quickly organized in the community center, and people came from all corners of Millbrook to discuss what had happened and what they could do to prevent similar incidents in the future. The meetings were emotional and sometimes difficult, as people shared their own stories of unfair treatment and discrimination. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who had made the original phone call that started the whole terrible chain of events, stood up at one of these meetings with tears streaming down her wrinkled face. Her voice shook as she spoke to the crowded room. "I was wrong," she said, her words barely audible at first. "I was completely wrong to call the police on Emma. I let fear and suspicion make me act badly toward a good person. I called the police because Emma looked different from what I expected to see in our neighborhood. That was wrong of me, and I'm deeply sorry." The police department, under intense public scrutiny and pressure, began implementing new training programs for all officers. Chief Patricia Adams, though deeply embarrassed by the incident, decided to use it as an opportunity to create real and lasting change in how her department operated. "We must do better," she told her officers during a mandatory meeting. "We serve all people in this community, and we must treat everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of what they look like or where they come from." In the days following the incident, Emma received hundreds of letters from soldiers and civilians from all across the country. People thanked her for her military service and praised her for maintaining her dignity and grace. Under such difficult circumstances, she read each letter carefully, deeply touched by the outpouring of support from people she had never met. But Emma was most moved by a letter she received from a young police officer in another state. The letter read, "General Thompson, your story has inspired me to examine my own biases and prejudices. I want to be the kind of officer who protects and serves everyone fairly, regardless of their background. Thank you for showing all of us what true dignity looks like, even in the face of injustice." Emma folded the letter carefully and placed it in a special box with the others. She knew that if her terrible experience could inspire even one person to treat others with more kindness and respect, then perhaps something good could come from all the pain and humiliation she had endured. 6 months had passed since the terrible day when Emma was arrested in front of her own mother's house. Now she stood before a packed community center in Millbrook, looking out at faces that had become familiar and dear to her over the past half-year. The large room was filled with people from all walks of life, and the atmosphere was one of celebration and hope. The Building Bridges program that Emma had started was celebrating its first graduation ceremony. What had begun as an idea born from pain and injustice had grown into something beautiful and transformative. Police officers sat next to military veterans, community leaders shared tables with ordinary citizens, and people who had never spoken to each other before were now friends. Everyone in the room had completed workshops on understanding, respect, and community service. They had learned to listen to each other's stories, to see past their differences, and to work together for the good of their town. The program had brought together people who might never have met otherwise, creating bonds that would last for years to come. Officer James Wilson was among the graduates, sitting quietly in the middle of the room. He had lost his job with the police department, but over the past 6 months, he had found something much more valuable, a chance to make amends for his terrible mistake. He now volunteered at the local community center, spending his days teaching young people about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity. When it was time for Wilson to speak, he stood up slowly and walked to the front of the room. His voice shook slightly as he began to address the audience, many of whom remembered him as the officer who had wrongfully arrested Emma. "I made a terrible mistake 6 months ago," he said, his words carrying the weight of genuine remorse. "I let my biases and prejudices cloud my judgment, and I hurt a good person who had dedicated her life to serving our country. I treated General Thompson badly because I made assumptions about her based on how she looked, not on who she really was." The room was completely silent as Wilson continued. "But General Thompson showed me something important. She showed me that even when we fall down, even when we make terrible mistakes, we can get back up and do better. We can learn from our failures and become better people." Emma smiled at Wilson from the podium, her expression filled with warmth and forgiveness. When it was her turn to speak, she stood up and looked out at the audience with genuine affection. "Forgiveness is not about forgetting what happened," she said in her calm, steady voice. "It's about choosing to build something better from the pieces of what was broken. When we forgive, we don't erase the past, but we refuse to let it define our future." In the front row, Margaret sat with her back straight and her eyes shining with pride. Her health had been completely restored, and she had become an unexpected advocate for police reform. She spent her days speaking at schools and community events, sharing her story and teaching people about the importance of seeing each person as an individual rather than a stereotype. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who had made the original phone call that started everything, had become one of Emma's closest friends. The two women had worked together to organize neighborhood gatherings where people could share their stories and get to know one another as human beings rather than strangers. These gatherings had brought the community closer together and had helped to heal old wounds. The police department itself had undergone a complete transformation under Chief Adams' leadership. New policies required all officers to receive extensive training in cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. Officers learned to approach every situation with an open mind and to treat every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or appearance. Surprisingly, crime rates in Millbrook had actually dropped as trust between police officers and community members improved. When people felt respected and valued by law enforcement, they were more willing to cooperate and work together to keep their neighborhoods safe. Emma's final words to the audience that day carried the wisdom that had been earned through her painful experience. "We all have the power to choose love over fear, understanding over prejudice, and hope over despair," she said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "When we make those choices, we don't just change ourselves, we change the world around us." As the ceremony ended and people began to file out of the community center, Emma walked outside to enjoy the fresh air and sunshine. She found a group of children playing in the small park next to the building, their laughter filling the air with joy and innocence. The children recognized her immediately and ran up to her with bright smiles on their faces, too. Them, she was not a general or a symbol of anything important. She was simply Miss Emma, a kind woman who had shown them that standing up for what's right can make a real difference in the world. "Miss Emma, will you come to our school next week?" asked little Lucy, a bright-eyed 7-year-old with pigtails and a gap-toothed grin. Emma knelt down to Lucy's level, bringing herself eye to eye with the child. "I'd be honored to visit your school," she replied with genuine warmth. What would you like me to talk about? Lucy thought for a moment, then said seriously, about how to be brave when things are scary. Emma smiled, remembering her own moments of fear and uncertainty. That's the most important lesson of all, she said softly. The end.